The sport of pro wrestling and the world of theater are not that different. They both have Grecian roots, they're both emboldened by lore, mystique, identity, pageantry, sex, and obviously violence. But for the IWA and Eddie Einhorn, it would not be a Homeric odyssey, but more like the story of the king of Thebes, Pentheus. While it doesn't involve as many gods striking women with lightning to make new gods of wine, nor people hitting snakes with sticks, it does have deception, lies, and the struggle that is between power structures, desires, and upholding the ideas of others while losing what made you who you are in the process. And while Eddie Einhorn did not have a blind fortune teller or a Greek chorus to give him the iggy that the shit was about to go down like the old king of Thebes did, there was an omen given in the return of one man. A man with a name that derived power, and a reputation for driving things up a wall and trying to stop them from going off a cliff. Historically speaking, I'm Matt Ryan, and this is our continuing story of how the first national wrestling promotion went up into the mountains and were slaughtered by the Bacchae, known as the National Wrestling Alliance, in service to their god Dionysus, I mean the wrestling establishment. While the World Wrestling Federation would pull off the same kind of Dionysus level of sneaky revenge just 9 years later with their national expansion, during the summer of 1975, the IWA was fighting to maintain its footprint across major markets despite shaky attendance, shaky rosters, and shaky skies. In the process of Eddie Einhorn absconding with the IWA the same way Cadmus decided to give up the throne when it seemed like shit wasn't working anymore, it would end up in the hands of the Martinezes, who, in the midst of all the madness, would make a call to the bullpen. And unlike Mariano Rivera, he wasn't coming in to close, he was coming in to stop the bleeding. And to quote the great George Carlin, "Look at all the blood!"
And Pedro, my spiritual papa, Pedro Martinez, gave me a call and said, hey, here's what we're doing. A guy named Eddie Einhorn, who had made his mark with broadcasting of collegiate broadcasting basketball primarily, with the tournaments and all the rest over a series of years, had just come into some additional money by selling his shares upstream into a larger media concern, and I wish you'd come down and work with me because we have no infrastructure here. We don't really have a business model. And basically I implied that I was going to say no to him, but because I wasn't really ready to go back in the wrestling business. I wasn't even sure I wanted to come back in the wrestling business. I had basically felt that was the past, and I was looking for something new to play in. But Pedro was like my spiritual papa. He's not my blood father, but he is like my spiritual father, and he basically says, hey, come help me. And so that's what happened. So they had already started. That was about August, approximately, July, August. And so I flew in to Winston-Salem Airport, Winston-Salem High Point, Greensboro Airport, the Triad Airport there.
It is hard to argue with Powers in that respect, as when you look at the IWA's business, they ran house shows, but there was no real set loops, because they were trying to fight a war on 3 separate fronts and get in where they could fit in with buildings in areas that were very, very far apart. Then you hazard a guess from me that they had their hopes set on Scott succumbing to that money offer that we've talked about before, but then not being able to pivot out of it until it was way too late, and seeing buildings and opportunities get shut down. That's kind of how I saw it, but Powers, he had his own view.
It was never laid on the table, I think. Pedro wanted to do it himself, and he wanted to do it with his son, Ronnie. And before, we had kind of parted the ways friendly, but back in 73, 74, I was ready to kind of leave the nest, so to speak. And I wasn't dependent on Pedro, but I was close to Pedro. And so I think he wanted to see if it would come together without Powers, but it didn't. And I'll explain name whenever you want the whys for that, because the dynamics were not there. The opportunity was there, large, but the dynamics. And so I think he wanted to see if he could do it without me. And then he couldn't find another me with the same skill set to build a grassroots business and an infrastructure, because it's all well and good to have money, but money doesn't carry the day in certain businesses. You can just plow it down a black hole. And when he called me, they were not cash flow positive. I was brought in, well, they could use some additional strength in the talent department, and they knew that a Brower-Powers combination was likely to draw. But primarily, Pedro, without going too deep, was bringing me in because on the phone what he said, listen, we're running shows, Richmond's and some New Jersey shows outdoors, and Savannah, Georgia, and Charlotte's and places like that. We're hitting big arenas. We're getting really good response. We've got a very unique, differentiated wrestling show and talent pool, but there's no underpinning. There's no business underneath it. The boys are only working a couple times and they go home, or they hang around. And so there wasn't a territory as per se. And at that time, there were, just like there are territories now, only larger, it was a territory. So you needed to keep the boys working 5 or 6 nights a week, give them one day off if you needed to, but if you didn't, don't do it. To give them a proper payday, to amortize the costs of your whole operation over 5 or 6 shows, or 8 or 9 or 10 shows if you're running 2 shows a night. You're amortizing your costs over a broader revenue base.
The other big issues included Pedro Martinez was over 60 and not really wanting to babysit and manage wrestlers, which is fair, but you are running the promotion. It's your company. Either way, Powers would start taking not only his share of responsibilities in the office, but working on some of the cards. But in his heart, Powers wanted to be an office guy over a worker, mainly because of not wanting to beat the piss out of his body anymore. But let's stop and talk about institutional memory for a second. Now, pro wrestling is a unique industry, not just for what it is in terms of a reality and genre-bending morality play / spectacle / sport / cultural connector / ad infinitum, etc., etc. But it's also the who, the why, and most certainly the how. Wrestlers are people who need to be kept busy, kept working, creatures of habit, chaos, and mayhem, especially in the 1970s when a majority of them had spent the majority of the last decade inside a Cadillac for hours on end, going from one show to another, one hotel to another, one bar to another, and shooting down the road, sometimes literally. With the IWA, as we said, there's no discernible loop or enough shows in a week for guys to get sustained work outside of TV and those bigger arena shows that would bounce around the map. Not having someone like a Scott or a Powers at the beginning of the company, who despite having separate skill sets, understood the base conceit of wrestling at the time to establish and maintain the circuit and work the regions locally, and find ways to develop different partnerships. With Hatch and Einhorn, these are TV people who didn't understand the concept of how pro wrestling is essentially retail politics. You need, especially in the 1970s, to have been seen as a present and active member of the community. Look at Jim Barnett and Eddie Graham. They were so successful in the 1960s and 70s as promoters because they were seen not only on their TV, but other local TV stations, radio, and newspaper coverage for what they did for the communities, donating time and money, whether to charities or being on the boards for different civic institutions, ingratiating themselves with the political elite of their given city, state, and even with the, Jimmy Carter, the president for GCW. He was a fan. His mother went to shows. That was what they were fighting against. The ability to hone in and develop community and public relations was what helped sustain Georgia and championship wrestling from Florida as revered cultural institutions even today in 2025, when we don't have a lot of those left in society. Either way, Powers filled the glue role for the IWA, but it was starting to be a little, too late, as the political machinations across the board weighed down on the IWA until November of 1975, when Einhorn saw the writing on the wall and decided fighting the tide wasn't worth it for him anymore. I'd call him not a masochist for wanting to get out of it, but he did own the Chicago White Sox, so Either way, here's how it went down from JP's perspective.
I'll tell you how it happened.
Okay.
Pedro calls me up and says, guess what? Eddie just called all the stations and canceled. And this is like maybe a Wednesday or so. They told them that there's going to be no show this weekend. Why? I said, why? It makes no sense. Why? This has a huge opportunity, and it's starting to get legs. This guy's getting legs. And so, which means wind, right? Which means a lasting ability to last. And so he said because apparently McMahon, that's McMahon Sr.'s attorney, called up the head guy, the chairman or whatever, of Corinthian Broadcasting, who had bought out Einhorn's company and made him a multimillionaire, and said, well, did you know that your golden boy there, Eddie Einhorn, is in the low-class wrestling business, and that doesn't fit with the upscale collegiate basketball business and all that. That's bad for your image. And so for whatever reason, that went. The head of Corinthians said, hey, get out or you got trouble. And Eddie folded. And as far as I know, that's the real story. Eddie's welcome to contest that, and if he can show me that it's different, that's fine. But the bottom line is, with absolutely no notice, he canceled. Now, you only cancel out of fear. You don't cancel if you think there's an opportunity there. And before that, everybody had smiles. When I'd see Eddie on, he'd have smiles. Hatch has got to have smiles. Pedro would have smiles. The boys would be smiling.
Yeah.
And so why all of a sudden, boom, it's gone?
Well, wow. I just... Vince McMahon Sr., the grand old man of New York wrestling, was a goddamn cop caller. Apple really didn't fall far from the tree, now did it? Think about that. Just think about that for a second. Also, if that's true and McMahon took a gigantic dump on his own business, it does paint how Vince II would shape his view of the business that way too. Maybe Vince II's desire to make the WWF/WWE into what it is we see today was shared by his father, or at least his father's dislike of other styles of wrestling. Because that's some self-loathing kind of shit, and, we smell our own with that. And also, the WWF's wrestling was seen by people outside of New York as not great. And if there were different flavors of ice cream for fans to see things that weren't, Baron Mikel Cicluna in a 15-minute draw and the occasional Bruno brawl, I can see them setting up a petty and churlish act like that they seem to have perpetuated throughout the years, no matter who's in charge. So that's a thing. Much like arena booking, the TV, and the talent rating, all alongside all the other mob tactics laid out over these last 15 episodes, this call by McMahon, alleged as it were, showcases that the old guard still controlled the business. But time and age would see the hands of fate take a turn on all of them. Barnett, Graham, Crockett, McMahon Sr. Now he would be the only one who got a real lifeboat. Well, for a little while at least. Not to be mean about it, but he did pass away soon after selling the business in 1982, alongside his longtime partner, structuring a favorable deal with Titan Sports, owned by Vince McMahon II and his wife Linda. See, the deal would be Titan would pay off the other owners of the WWF, which included Phil Zacco, Gorilla Monsoon, and also the manager of Bruno Sammartino and Bob Backlund, Arnold Skaaland, with the profits of basically MSG shows. That was the case. They were paying off this $1 million purchase with MSG gate receipts. Powers and the Martinez family, soon just Powers, as Ron Martinez would be paid off and Pedro would soon find himself settling into retirement, as the IWA would give up the ship in 1977 after trying to bring a war to Jim Crockett's front door. But something would happen just a few months before the IWA would join the NWF and others in the great word jumble in the sky. That would change the fate of pro wrestling as we know it, just not for another 6 years. See, on December 17th, 1976, WTCG, home of Georgia Championship Wrestling, would send out its signal for the first time to 4 cable systems in Kansas, Virginia, Alabama, and Nebraska. 1 year after the IWA would close their doors, WTCG would find themselves carried in all 50 states, with Georgia Championship Wrestling quickly becoming one of its most watched programs. There would not be peace in the Valley over the next few years, as opposition in Knoxville, Nashville, and Kentucky would be fueled by events such as the Plan B tape and the rise of Macho Man Randy Savage, as the cracks in the pro wrestling establishment were beginning to show. And in 1977, one of the wall dams completely collapsed. Remember the last episode when we talked about the Gulas Welch office? Well, Jerry Jarrett, who had become one of the youngest and most respected bookers in the industry after being a key cog in the battle against All South and other booker Tom Renesto, had bought into the business of Gulas and Welch, with Jarrett running one end of the territory and Gulas running the other. Jarrett was quickly showing in his towns that his presentation of wrestling was what the people of Memphis, Louisville, Evansville, and Tupelo, Jarrett's towns, were looking for, while Gulas's part of the territory would see houses declining and payoffs declining even faster. What was the difference? Well, there was one quantifiable difference outside of the booking of Jerry Jarrett, and that would be George Gulas, the baby boy of Nick Gulas. George went from commentator and referee to babyface, and well, in terms of being equipped to carry that spot, he might have done better carrying pianos upstairs. Yeah. So, at some point, the elder Gulas demanded that Jarrett put his son, his baby boy, on the cards on his end of the territory. Jarrett, thinking that he owned a piece of the business and that his towns were his towns, balked and said, no, I'm not doing that. Gulas, being a wrestling promoter, made it clear that, in fact, Jarrett owned nothing, that the shares he was paying for in his mother's name would never come to him and were never his to begin with. Jarrett, someone weaned in the wrestling business and empowered by mentors such as Jim Barnett, Eddie Graham, and Bill Watts, decided that he was done with Gulas and he was opening up his own shop. The man who helped sustain the status quo just 5 years earlier amidst an all-out war for the state of Georgia, following what Gunkel and Renesto set up in 71, as he decided to become the rebel, bringing Jerry Lawler in as a partner, lining up every top talent in the territory to walk out. Not just in the ring, though. See, Jarrett and Lawler would take their brand of wrestling from the Gulas-produced Channel 13 show over to WMC Channel 5. In the process of that, the program director and weatherman for Channel 13 would follow suit to Channel 5 because they were Lance Russell and Dave Brown. That's right. They quit their jobs on the top TV station in the city, which they knew was because of the wrestling show that had made them into institutions in Memphis, to follow Jarrett and Lawler and work at Channel 5. Much like Lance and Dave, the audience followed almost as soon as Jarrett and Lawler were opened up for business. But unlike Einhorn, unlike Gunkel, or Powers, or Doyle, Barnett, Martinez, the NWA was not coming after Jarrett and Lawler with a cavalry to help save Nick Gulas. See, Gulas, despite his unyielding loyalty to the National Wrestling Alliance, was not the most popular guy from his fellow promoters in the NWA, while Jarrett was beloved by people with a lot of power because he learned from them and he worked with them as a booker. The NWA was playing with the smart money, even though Jarrett and Lawler were not members of the NWA. But here, in 1977, this is where it all started. This is where the indicator light of wrestling as we knew it turned on, and everything started to change. Next time on Historically Speaking, I will lay out the case for why pro wrestling going national was not only inevitable, but could have been done sooner, smarter, and kept the territories alive. Also, with one last episode of our full season of Historically Speaking, I'm a level with you. I love doing this show. And Season 2 will not have much of a delay between the season finale of this season and its premiere, but there's a reason why I'm talking to you right now. We're gonna be changing topics, mainly genres. Not forever, but this show was developed around wrestling history and other stuff. I want to keep my love for wrestling history fresh and not burn out on the subject and keep you guys waiting again for what we know to be our next series, which will be the Great Wrestling War of Atlanta. That's going to come to you in early 2026. That's going to come after this next season. Because we're going to dive into something that we touched on a little bit last week and we've dabbled in conversation about over the last 15 episodes of this show. But we're going to tune in to a slightly different signal. See you on the air, babies.
Our trip through time begins 6 years before the station's 1922 debut. Young David Sarnoff was an employee of the Marconi Telegraph Company.
And we're going to give you a sneak preview of it. It's just been recorded by Perez Prado, the old Mambo King.
Waxed up! Yeah. He's taking a little something to take the edge off of life.
Come on, I'm nervous, man. It's my first day.
We think we can win here at NBC with AM radio. I think we've pretty well proven that with, Howard and I do a lot of entertaining on the radio. I'm not disgusting. I'm not dirty. I'm not going to rape your daughter.
You're a very clever guy. You're very clever, but you're not funny. You're not entertaining. I can see right through you, Bob.
Good afternoon.
Hey, what's up, bro?
How you doing, Al?
Not much. It's Opie and Anthony.
Did you see that, Robert? Another blatant example of how they're ripping me off. I'm an innovator. No one's ever original anymore. That was obviously a blatant ripoff of me.
Wait a minute. Psycho Mark, is there anal going on in Ken Stevens' our boss's office?
Welcome. RonandFez.com. The guys at the top of your money list. Goodbye. 1027 WNEW.
This is what happened with Paul Mercurio and his team about an hour and a half ago.
We're in St. Pat's, and he's doing the balloon knot inside, and the security guy is coming up to us right now.